Every murder is heinous, mysterious, and chilling, but a couple of them comes up with twists that can beat any Hollywood thriller. In this case, a woman got killed, but no one came up with any lead. Detectives had prime suspect, but no evidence to pin him down. Because there was only one person who knew everything, but that person started a new family at the expense of the decreased family. Yes, it's a mess and it's twisted. Still, how everything got solved after decades, let's investigate. Tracy Harris. Quiet, kind-hearted woman everyone loved to be around. She was a young mom, hard-working and devoted to her little girl, Carolyn. But on March 7, 1990, she suddenly vanished without a trace, much like what happened to Rosamund Pike in the film, Gone Girl. At that point, she was still living with her ex-husband, Carl Harris. Yeah, she was divorced, but for whatever reason, they still shared the same house, and even the same bed. When Tracy disappeared, Carl insisted there was no way she would ever leave Carolyn behind. But a week later, the worst possible news came. Tracy's body was found downstream in the Chattahoochee River. The autopsy confirmed what everyone feared. It wasn't an accident. Someone had killed her. Naturally, all eyes turned to Carl, because he had a history of getting violent with Tracy. They had been fighting a lot, especially about his new girlfriend. People who knew them recalled times when Carl went short-tempered on Tracy. But despite all the suspicions, no arrest was made. And that way, for years, Tracy's case sat there, cold, with dead ends and no lead. But then in 2016, the Ozark Police Department's cold case unit decided to take another look. And guess who was their main suspect again? Carl. This time, the case against him was built on his past violence, his relationship drama, and some offhand remarks suggesting he knew Tracy wasn't coming back. And just when the investigation started again to seem cliché, something happened that changed everything. Back in 1990, Tracy was last seen alive on March 7th, and just a week later, her body washed up in the Chattahoochee, snagged on a log as water levels receded. She used to like to hang out in that area with her friends, so early attention from investigators focused there. Tracy had drowned, but also there were marks around her neck. She'd been strangled. At first, the case was only a missing persons report. However, upon finding her body, it evolved into a homicide investigation. The police questioned Carl, as he probably was the last person to have seen her alive. He had picked her up from work that night, dropped her off at home, and then went to his own job at a grocery store. But when detectives searched the house, they found no signs of a struggle. It was only after this discovery that one more piece of the puzzle surfaced. One that made Tracy's death even more chilling. She was afraid of the water. Her friends claimed that she would never have gone near that river on her own. As for one childhood friend, Selena Dodson, she remembered Tracy freaking out when she got dunked underwater during her baptism. Carl was also kind of a childhood friend of Tracy. They met in high school. By the time she graduated, she was pregnant and they got married. Everyone adored little Carolyn, but it wasn't easy being young parents. Carl would later claim that they had a happy home life, but Tracy's friends and family told a different story, filled with arguments, tension, and fear. And when the case opened after years, finally it would reveal what had actually taken place that night in 1990. Everybody in town knew something was wrong between Tracy and Carl. 14 different people had seen or heard about the fights, the ugly ones. Dawn Beasley, who had lived with them for a while, actually saw it. She said Carl was the kind of man who needed to be in control, and when he lost it, things got violent. One time, all Tracy did was ask for some money to pay the water bill. That is all it took. Carl snatched her and grabbed her throat and bent her backward and was threatening to kill her. Dawn didn't bat an eye. She leapt in and got him stopped. Later, she told the police everything and said that Carl was abusive. Everyone in town knew that house was trouble. They talked about it on grocery store aisles, in church pews, on front porches. So when Tracy vanished, it didn't take much for people to put two and two together. He finally did it, some murmured. Yet no one ever reported Carl to the police, even though everyone knew he had a short fuse. Back then, if she didn't press charges, there wasn't much the law could do. In simple terms, she was trapped, and Carl, he had already moved on, if you could even call it that. At the time Tracy vanished, he was entangled with a 17-year-old girl. He spoke about wanting to marry her, but he had one issue: Tracy. He made people believe that he couldn't leave because of child support, which only piqued everyone's interest even more. Then there were the remarks, cavalier ones, about how Tracy wasn't returning. He swore he never said anything like that, but the people who heard him thought otherwise. Investigators were sure Carl was behind it. Everything pointed to him: motive, chances, and access. But suspicion alone isn't enough to make an arrest, and without solid evidence, the case hit a dead end. Over the years, Carl claimed he'd checked in with the police to see if they had any new leads, but officers said that wasn't true. He didn't seem to care one bit. That only made people more certain he was guilty. Meantime, Carolyn did not live with her dad. She had no interest, and at 5 she would cry about the mother whom she had few memories of. She'd crumple anytime she got a timeout. Her grandmother, Tracy's mother, took her to Texas to find a new beginning for her in Ozark. She was growing up to know the truth. Her mother had been murdered, and everybody suspected her father. She heard the stories, the warnings, the way people talked about him like he was a ticking time bomb. But she never went looking for Carl. However, this was not the end. Carolyn was 21 years old when Carl first contacted her. It had been years since they last saw each other, and for the first time in ages, they finally met face to face. She had so many questions, especially about her mother, but she did not ask him. Deep inside, she never believed he would tell her the truth, but she badly wanted to figure out what really happened. It became more than just curiosity, it became a mission. Then, in 2015, Carolyn's grandmother passed away, and she went back to Ozark to lay her to rest beside Tracy, her mother. But being back in town, surrounded by memories of the past, stirred something in her. That's when she started talking to people, hoping anyone knew something new. One conversation stood out. A woman mentioned that her son was close to the sheriff. Maybe, just maybe, there was still something out there waiting to be uncovered. That was enough to get investigators to take another look at Tracy Harris's case. Carl had always been their prime suspect, but now, with fresh eyes on old evidence, they started digging again. The cold case unit went through witness statements from 1990, tracking down people who might still remember details. One witness remembered that Carl had chillingly said something that indicated that he thought that he would never be caught. Then there was Carl's girlfriend at the time. She had been just 17 when Tracy was killed, and she couldn't remember everything but did remember to hear about the death of Tracy and later question if Carl might have had any involvement in the killing. Then more people began to come out and say Carl had made some suspicious comments in the years following Tracy's killing. In the meantime, he had long since left Ozark, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the dark cloud of the past. He bounced around from job to job, working as a bouncer, then in construction, eventually settling in South Carolina. He probably thought he'd left it all behind. But in 2016, investigators tracked him down. At first, they gave him hope that they had found the real killer. They arrested him on September 13, 2016, 2 weeks later for Tracy's murder. But Carl's lawyer, David Harrison, called it a sham, said the whole thing was just politics, a desperate attempt to close an old case without real evidence. He pointed out that there was no physical proof tying Carl to the crime. And Carl? He stuck to his story. He wasn't worried about any new evidence because, as far as he was concerned, there wasn't any. But for those haunted by Tracy's murder for decades, the case was never simply about evidence. For decades, one question defined Carolyn Harris's psyche: who really killed her mother Tracy in 1990? But police arrested Carl Harris anyway, and the charges seemed so consistent with everyone's suspicions. Still, something didn't add up. Their case was largely based on old interviews from 1990. Investigators pieced together a timeline. Carl left work around 9 p.m., went home, attacked Tracy, then drove her body to the Chattahoochee River. By 9:30 p.m., he was picking up his friend Bobby Herring, meaning he somehow covered 20 miles and got rid of a body in under 30 minutes. But David Harrison, Carl's defense attorney, called this BS. He said the timeline didn't add up and accused investigators of forcing the narrative just to pin the crime on Carl. And there was another suspect, Bobby Herring himself. He had a criminal record that included a rape conviction. But prosecutors dismissed that idea, saying Herring had an alibi. Fast forward to 2016, and the case was back under the microscope. Prosecutors scrambled to track down witnesses, but after 26 years, A lot of them had moved or even passed away. Investigators also revisited the crime scene, the bridge where Carl allegedly dumped Tracy's body. It was 7 miles from their home, covered in graffiti, with random names spray-painted on the concrete. Meanwhile, the legal battle dragged on. Carl was out on bail after only 2.5 weeks in jail, and both sides were digging in their heels. The prosecution was sure they had a solid case, but the defense was just as certain they'd tear it apart in court. Their argument? The case was built on old witness statements about Carl's abusive past, and none of those witnesses were reliable. But one person never wavered: Carl's daughter, Carolyn. She attended every hearing, convinced her father was guilty and determined to see him behind bars. Finally, after 3 years of delay, Carl's trial was fixed for January 13, 2020. But a few days to the beginning of the trial, a forgotten witness statement from 1990 was suddenly discovered. This was from Dawn Hulbert, now Beasley, who had lived with Carl and Tracy and witnessed the abuse firsthand. And the way she described it? It eerily matched how Tracy had been killed. Finding Beasley wasn't easy. Investigators went through wrong numbers and dead ends before finally tracking her down. She had moved away and had no idea Carl had even been arrested. When they asked her to testify, she flat out refused, said she was too busy with work. The next morning, the prosecutors tried again through a text. Same answer, no. But they weren't giving up. They issued a subpoena, forcing her to testify. Beasley was furious. She made a scene, yelling at the legal team for disrupting her life. And with that, the case took yet another unexpected turn. For years, Dawn had kept her mouth shut. But one day, she finally picked up the phone and called Assistant DA Jordan Davis with a bombshell that changed everything. She admitted that she had given her reasons for not testifying before. But the real truth? The man on trial wasn't the one who did it. This was shocking, and Jordan didn't initially buy it. Then Dawn dropped the real bombshell. It was her ex-husband, Jeff Beasley, who had in fact confessed to killing Tracy on the very night it happened. Dawn illustrated a picture. It was March 7, 1990. She was pregnant, just shy of her 21st birthday, and fast asleep when Jeff came home and woke her up. He looked shaken. Then he told her he had gotten into a struggle with Tracy and it had turned deadly. He panicked, took her body to the river, and got rid of it. Dawn begged him to go to the police, but he refused, and just like that, she was stuck. Torn between doing the right thing and protecting the life she had built, she chose silence. Fear kept her frozen. Fear that no one would believe her. Fear of losing everything if she spoke up. When Tracy's body was found, Dawn did tell a statement to the police. She said that Carl threatened Tracy, though she omitted the part where Jeff straight up confessed. Nobody even asked her if she had her own suspicions, so she convinced herself of not really lying. Besides, she told herself, Carl had made Tracy's life miserable, and perhaps this is some sort of déjà vu stuff from the universe. And here's the kicker. Despite Jeff's rap sheet, prison time, burglary, even escape attempts, the cops never even interrogated him. They just figured he and Dawn were in this together. And so life continued. Dawn married him, had kids, and locked the truth away like it never happened. They never spoke of it, not once. But that weight got heavier with time. She thought of Carolyn, Tracy's daughter. She should have felt nothing but sympathy, and she did, partly. But mostly she felt trapped. Trapped by the secret she had been keeping for years. When in 1991 Jeff was arrested again and sentenced to 5 years, Dawn did not speak up to protect their children's sense of normalcy. But it didn't take long before the marriage fell apart. Jeff turned abusive, and after 13 years and 4 kids, she divorced him. Still, the secret gnawed at her. For years, she would toy with the idea of telling the truth. An anonymous tip, a letter, maybe a confession when she was on her deathbed. But every time, the fear of what it would do to her kids stopped her. And then came Jordan Davis, the prosecutor who was determined to get her to testify at Carl Harris's trial. That was the moment Dawn knew. She couldn't keep it inside any longer. It was time to tell her children the truth, that their father had killed someone, and she had been hiding it for 30 years. Just days before the trial was supposed to start, prosecutors were still trying to wrap their heads around what Dawn had just told them. At first, the name Jeff Beasley didn't ring any bells, but then a small detail from the investigation came rushing back. During a visit to the crime scene, they had noticed something odd. Under the bridge where Tracy's body was found, the name Beasley had been spray-painted in big, bold letters. Back then, it hadn't seemed important. Dawn had been listed under her maiden name, Hulbert, so no one connected the dots. But now with Dawn pointing the finger at her ex-husband, the whole thing took on a new meaning. They had missed something huge. The trial went into recess. Investigators didn't have to wait long to catch up with Jeff Beasley. He was an Ozark local driving his truck for work. When finally brought into question, Beasley played cool, feigning shock over even being accused of murder. However, it wasn't before long that the investigators asked to have him polygraphed, at which point Beasley agreed, but flunked it big time. For 4 hours and more, he was interrogated by the investigating team. He denied everything, getting frustrated more and more as they persisted in their questioning. Then all of a sudden, he broke down and he said yes, he had indeed spent the night with Tracy. An affair, he claimed. Tracy wanted to leave Carl, and she also wanted him to leave Dawn. They'd gone down to the river, waded into the water, and then somehow things got hot and heavy. She went down and didn't come back up, he said. But again, it did not add up, not even close, and Dawn recalled Jeff saying a completely different version of things years ago, a version that sounded like he and Tracy were fighting inside the Harris house. And anyone who actually knew Tracy, they didn't believe the affair story for 1 second. Carl would never have tolerated that, and besides, Tracy was deathly afraid of water. No way she was going to wander into a river on her own. Then there were the bruises. The autopsy had shown clear marks on Tracy's neck, the kind that pointed to strangulation. Beasley swore up and down that he hadn't strangled her. But when they asked if he had pushed her underwater, his confidence wavered. He hesitated. And then in a weak attempt to explain himself, he muttered something about how if that had happened, he'd like to think it was an accident. That was it. Finally, investigators knew they had their guy. Jeff Beasley was indicted for Tracy's murder. Meanwhile, back in town, prosecutors had to break the news to Carolyn, just 17 hours before Carl Harris's trial was about to start. She had spent her entire life believing her father was guilty. And now? Now she was being told he wasn't. The case against Carl was dropped. Carolyn just lost it. The truth washed over her like a tsunami, relief, grief, and shock. So it's January 13th, 2020, the day Carl Harris was supposed to go on trial for murder. Instead of courtroom drama, though, prosecutors made a complete 180. They dropped the case. Why? Because they just arrested the real killer, Jeff Beasley, 54-year-old guy from Ozark. He was also stunned, relieved, but also furious. Meanwhile, Beasley took a plea deal and got 30 years behind bars. There was some noise over Dawn, the key witness that helped crack the case. Some people felt that she should be charged as well, but the prosecutors just dropped it. It was enough that her testimony brought in the real killer for them. For Carl, though, this was not over yet. His relief was drowned out by anger. Beside him, his lawyer, David Harrison, he attacked the detectives straight to their faces, complaining that they had done their work sloppily and were even fabricating evidence. And he was not just whistling. He followed through with action, filing a $6 million lawsuit against the city of Ozark for the nightmare they had placed him through. The police? They politely declined to comment because of the pending case. One of the prosecutors later admitted that if things had played out differently, Carl probably would have been convicted. And even after all this, Carolyn wanted nothing to do with Carl. She couldn't move past the allegations of abuse, even if he was now a free man. Instead, she held on to the memory of the mother she never really got to know, piecing together her life through stories of those who remembered her as kind, quiet, and humble. What's your take on this Layery case? What's your thoughts on all their actions, be it Carloin, Carl, or Tracy? Who was right and who was wrong in your eyes? And let the debate go on in the comment section. But this is not the only cause that could beat even a Hollywood thriller. Watch this next one, where two people got into some kinky things like 50 Shades of Grey, but instead of steamy romance, it ended up in a gruesome murder. Subscribe to the channel for more true crime content like this, and see you soon.